Back in 1988, almost no one had seen the film The Last Temptation of Christ. But even so, by the time Martin Scorsese's film hit theaters, it was already a national emergency, denounced from pulpits, picketed in the streets, condemned on radio waves across the country. The people leading the charge hadn't seen the movie either. They didn't need to. The outrage was the point. That's the story Isaac Butler tells in his new book, The Perfect Moment: God, Sex, Art, and the Birth of America's Culture Wars. It chronicles the origins of the culture wars and why we're still fighting them today. The grievances, the moral panics, the persecution narratives, the outrage machine, those were built decades before Trump rode down the golden escalator. Trump is less a maverick than a craven opportunist who leached into a system that was already cracking. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to 1988, the final year of the Reagan presidency. The Cold War was winding down, and as it did, Butler argues, many of the institutions that once gave Americans a shared sense of identity and meaning, the church, the family, the workplace, were entering what he calls a period of profound overlapping crises. The religious right saw an opening to seize power inside the Republican Party and across the country. And the machinery to do it was already in place. Back in 1979, the televangelist Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, the organization that turned conservative Christians into one of the Republican Party's most powerful voting blocs and helped propel Ronald Reagan to the White House in the first place. Its mission was simple: a nationwide return to what it called traditional family values. At the same time, Donald Wildman, a Mississippi minister and founder of the Conservative American Family Association, was perfecting a different weapon: the organized boycott. Using church networks, direct mail campaigns, and activist pressure, Wildman spent a decade targeting corporations, television programs, and advertisers that he considered morally dangerous. So by the time Scorsese's film arrived in 1988, the infrastructure was in place. Wildman mailed action packets to 2.5 million people. There were petitions. There were fundraising appeals. James Dobson, an influential evangelical broadcaster, devoted an entire episode of his radio program to denouncing the film. He called it, quote, the most blasphemous evil attack on the church and the cause of Christ in the history of entertainment, end quote. He admitted he hadn't seen the film. What he hadn't seen was a film that imagined a fully human Jesus, one who doubts, one who suffers, and in a dying hallucination pictures an ordinary life before rejecting it for the cross. To its critics, a Christ who could even be tempted was a blasphemous Christ. To the architects of the outrage, the entire point was to whip everyone up into hysterics. Opponents of the Last Temptation of Christ cast themselves as victims. Christians, they said, were under attack. Isaac Butler shows how that strategy, borrowing the language of civil rights, became a defining feature of the culture wars, the most powerful religious bloc in the country presenting itself as a persecuted minority. Sound familiar? Perhaps you sat in a school board meeting over which books your children are allowed to read are discussed, or encountered a viral Facebook post about immigrants eating your neighbor's cats. Or maybe you've heard those rumors about transgender people lurking in women's bathrooms with no evidence of any threat, even as the real documented danger to women, sexual violence, overwhelmingly committed by cisgender men, is all but ignored. Curiously, these self-appointed guardians of women never seem as outraged by that very real epidemic. You see, the details change, the methods change, but the formula has remained the same. Back then, manufacturing outrage was expensive and slow. The Mississippi minister had to mail out millions of packets and buy time on hundreds of radio stations. Activists spent months building momentum. Today, all it takes is a post, a meme, or a smartphone with an internet connection. The outrage that once took months to manufacture now reaches millions in a matter of hours. But the perfect moment is not just about how the right won these fights. It's also about how often the institutions on the receiving end surrendered. In fact, the book takes its title from one of the biggest cultural flashpoints from that era, the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe's exhibition called The Perfect Moment. A handful of photographs were sexually explicit, but that was all the ammunition that the culture warriors needed. Conservative Senator Jesse Helms and Republican Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York were already attacking the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, furious that taxpayer dollars had helped fund work that they considered obscene. They wanted the NEA defunded. and any art they deemed morally reprehensible removed from public life. So when Robert Mapplethorpe's exhibit was scheduled to arrive in Washington, D.C. in 1989, the Corcoran Gallery caved. Its director canceled the show just weeks before its opening, fearful of losing federal funding. Americans today are no longer strangers to watching institutions capitulate, surrendering a little ground in the hope that the controversy will pass. But we know now that the controversy rarely does pass. American universities, media outlets, law firms, and cultural institutions keep convincing themselves that one more accommodation will finally make the pressure stop. It never does. It never has. It never will. 4 years after the backlash to Scorsese's film, the Christian conservative effort to police culture and dictate who belongs in this country finally got a name: America's Culture Wars. It was not just a political slogan. It was a culmination of a project that the right had been building for more than a decade. By 1991, the loudest voice belonged to Pat Buchanan, a Nixon speechwriter turned conservative firebrand who spent years warning that America was losing its cultural identity. In 1992, he took a rare and aggressive step. He challenged a sitting president from his own party. And the weapon he reached for was the very fight we've been tracing. His campaign took Marlon Riggs' Tongues United, an award-winning documentary about being black and gay in America, funded in part by the National Endowment of the Arts, and turned it into a political attack ad designed to make the government look like it was subsidizing obscenity. It worked. Buchanan took more than a third of the New Hampshire vote from a sitting Republican president. He rattled the George Herbert Walker Bush campaign White House so badly that the chairman of the NEA was gone within weeks. Now, Buchanan, you'll remember, ultimately lost the nomination, but Bush, desperate to hold his right flank together, handed Buchanan a primetime convention speech anyway, and Buchanan used that speech to declare what he called a culture war.
We disagreed with President Bush, but we stand with him for the freedom to choose religious schools. And we stand with him against the amoral idea that gay and lesbian couples should have the same standing in law as married men and women. We stand with President Bush for right to life and for voluntary prayer in the public schools. And we stand against putting our wives and daughters and sisters into combat units of the United States Army. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America.
Abortion, gay people, women in combat. In 1992, Buchanan drew a line through the country and demanded everyone pick a side. Between then and now, the promise of neoliberalism proved illusory, and trust in institutions collapsed. And since then, social media has fractured our shared sense of reality and amplified every grievance. So the idea that Trump brought the fringe to power gives Trump far too much credit. Trump, ever opportunistic, simply smelled blood in the water and leached into the crisis. What Buchanan preached from the fringe more than 30 years ago is now at the center of the GOP's platform. Many of you know these grievances are not new because you've lived through them before. You've seen this before. You saw that video. You probably watched that speech when it happened. What's changed is that the fringe that developed this playbook in the 1980s is no longer on the outside looking in. The National Endowment for the Arts, the very agency the right spent the 80s trying to destroy, is now being dismantled from the inside. Grant recipients have to certify that they do no diversity work, that federal money will not promote what the administration calls gender ideology. The vagueness, Butler notes, is the point. It's built to make the artists censor themselves and make the institutions censor themselves. Most of the agency's 2025 grants were simply canceled. But history also offers another lesson. The pushback is never that far behind. Again and again, Americans have shown a stubborn commitment to freedom of conscience and expression. When activists tried to literally buy The Last Temptation of Christ from Universal Pictures simply so that they could bury it, the studio refused to sell it. It published its refusal in a full-page advertisement in major newspapers across the country. The message was, quote, simple. If everyone in America agreed on religious, political, and artistic truths, there would be no need for our constitutional guarantees. Only in totalitarian states are all people forced to accept one version of the truth. In the United States, no one sect or coalition has the power to set boundaries around each person's freedom to explore religious and philosophical questions, whether through speech, books, or film. These freedoms protect all of us. They are precious. They are not for sale. We cannot accept your offer, end quote. Indeed, this playbook is older than America itself. When the Athenian playwright Aristophanes was attacked for mocking the powerful politicians, he responded with more satire. He was prosecuted for ridiculing the statesman Cleon, so he made Cleon an even bigger target in his next play. 24 centuries later, we're still reading Aristophanes. In ancient Rome, Emperor Augustus exiled the poet Ovid. And 2,000 years later, those poems are still the most influential literature in the Western canon. The same pattern appears throughout history. Books are banned, art is censored, ideas are suppressed, and yet they persist. The clearest example came in Cincinnati in 1990, shortly after the Corcoran Gallery in Washington canceled Robert Mapplethorpe's exhibit. That capitulation sent a chill through the museum world. One of the directors watching was Dennis Barry of the Cincinnati Contemporary Arts Center. He described the moment this way, quote, that announcement really swept through the room like wildfire. All of us who were directors of museums recognized that the door had opened up for hostile censorship against our organizations, end quote. So when the perfect moment arrived in Cincinnati, Barry chose a different path. He refused to cancel the show, and the response was extraordinary. A grand jury indicted both Barry and the museum on obscenity charges. For the first time in American history, a museum stood criminal trial over what hung on its walls. Just think about that. The state was literally using criminal law to publish a museum for displaying art. Police even cleared the galleries and videotaped the photographs as evidence. We tend to think today's battles over censorship and political pressure are unprecedented, as we say. They're really not. Previous generations of Americans faced their own campaigns to narrow the boundaries of acceptable speech and art and expression, and it's worth knowing about them because they rarely end well for the would-be tyrants. The jury in the Cincinnati case deliberated for all of 2 hours. Then, in what became a landmark First Amendment victory, it unanimously acquitted the museum and its director on each and every count. 8 ordinary citizens were handed the question that culture warriors have never stopped asking. Who gets to decide what Americans are allowed to see? And their answer was clear. Not the government. That was 1990. Butler is writing in 2026. He does not pretend to have all the answers. What he offers instead is a poignant reminder of the one lesson history teaches us over and over again. Quote, it is hard to see at this moment how we could possibly put these various Humpty Dumptys back together again, or as doing so is probably both impossible and unwise, what we should do instead. What I do know is that people have always made and will always make art. Part of possessing a consciousness is wanting to be known while also living with the fundamental mysteriousness of human beings, including ourselves. Art is how we enter that mystery and how we express it to the world. It is how we know and are known. History shows us that this aspect of our humanity cannot be stopped. The ability of those in power to control it is finite, even in the direst of circumstances. If we cannot keep faith with our nation at this moment, or with our government, or with each other, or perhaps we can at least keep faith with that.